Okay, picture this. You're driving an ice cream truck through Florida. It's January, which in most places would be kind of a questionable business model. But hey, this is Florida. Your name is Michael Keatley, and you've been driving this route long enough that people know you. Then one night, two men approach your truck. One of them pulls out a gun. He shoots you, but you survive. But the damage is severe. Your hand is permanently injured, so you can't work the way you did before. And according to prosecutors, something else starts happening. You become obsessed with finding the people who did this to you. And you start asking questions and you hear the name creep. You become convinced that if you can find a creep, you can find the person responsible for nearly killing you. So for months, you look until Thanksgiving morning, 2010. Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Culinary, the show where we explore the strange intersection of food history and true crime. And this week's episode started because I was eating ice cream. Well, to be more specific, I purchased an excessive amount of ice cream for the fam for like a family getaway. It was not consumed. We had to move it outside the Airbnb. And so I thought, oh, no worries. I will transport it with ice packs in a dry bag. You will be shocked to know that 3 to 4 hours later, upon arriving at my destination, I was met with cold, fluffy soup, which I did indeed attempt to consume over the sink. It was a whole thing. Throughout this adventure of thermodynamics and sugar, I was like, wait a second, where does ice cream even come from? How were people even eating frozen desserts hundreds, nay, thousands of years before someone could walk over to a freezer and get a scoop? Well, hold on to your pints because we're jumping down this rocky road. Hey, before we dive into the story today, can I just ask you to please go and rate and review the show 5 stars, maybe a little comment, a little something like, hey, love the show. It would really help me and I would be so grateful. Love you so much. Okay, so it all begins with one thing, that is the cold. We're talking winter is coming type vibes. Humans discovered that when it's hot outside, cold things are indeed delightful. Many a culture figured this out. Thus, different cultures developed their own versions of chilled and frozen foods. But they all faced a fundamental problem. You need cold to keep cold. So if you live near a mountain or a frozen lake, you can go to the cold place and get the ice. Then move the ice and keep the ice. But how? One of the most fascinating solutions came from ancient Persia. They developed enormous structures called yakhchals. I'm probably saying that wrong, mea culpa, but envision kind of an egg that is submerged to about halfway. The word yakhchals means ice pit. And this is where they would store the ice. So if you imagine that egg, about half of it is under the surface of the ground. That is where you would keep the ice. It's the coldest part. The dome, or the top of the egg, is where the hot air would come out. So starting 400 BCE, these giant mud brick, again, egg-shaped, semi-submerged ice facilities were how they kept ice cold. The walls are made from materials designed to insulate the interior from the brutal heat outside and melt water drained away. They even made their own ice. Basically, they'd kind of have like ponds or areas of water. And at night, when the temperature dipped enough, the top would freeze. They would take that ice, put it into the yakhchals during the day. Ta-da! Their own ice machines. So for thousands of years, people living in hot climates had essentially created giant passive freezers or refrigerators. And we know people really were doing this thousands of years ago because around 3,800 years ago, records from the ancient kingdom of Mari in modern-day Syria describe blocks of ice being brought from nearby mountains to the royal court, where they were stored in ice houses and used to cool the king's wine. In terms of how they got the ice there, snow and ice were collected from mountains and transported towards cities using whatever transportation technology existed, i.e. horses, donkeys and mules, sleds, eventually wagons. I even watched a video of a dude in Venezuela. He was like 70 or 80 years old, climbs to the top of this mountain. It's like 16 miles one way. He's got his 3 donkeys. He gets his blocks of ice. I think it's glacier ice. He said it tasted like mineral water. Gets like 60-pound blocks of ice, wraps them in straw, puts them on the donkeys, comes all the way down. He does that twice a week, and he takes those blocks, goes to the market, sells it. I think it was like $5 per block. And then the people who buy it make like shaved ice and stuff like that, or even ice cream. So we're not 100% sure how they transported, but what we do know is that they used big ass pieces. And the reason is science. So if I hand you an ice cube and tell you to walk through the desert, that ice cube is doomed. But hundreds of pounds of tightly packed snow or large blocks of ice behave differently. And that's because a large mass has less exposed surface area compared to the total volume. So proportionately, it melts more slowly because less of the surface area is exposed to air. Basically, I looked this up. So let's say you have a teeny tiny cube and it's 1 centimeter per side. The ratio of the surface area to the total cube is like 6:1. But let's say you have a cube that is 10 centimeters per side. Now that ratio of surface area, melty sides to not melty cube area, is only 0.6:1. So just scale that up to huge amounts, and really what it's saying is the bigger the better. And then things like insulation through straw, reeds, cloth, and even sawdust could further help slow the melting. And maybe they transported them at night, right? No sunshine, a little colder, less melty. And it wasn't just about like fully stopping the melting. I mean, people understood that ice would melt. It was just about kind of mitigating it as much as possible and trying to get as much of that ice, all of that work, as much of it as possible to the final destination. One thing I didn't quite realize is that they also wanted the water to drain away as quickly as possible. Water speeds up the melting of the ice. I wondered why. I couldn't remember from my lessons in thermodynamics, but apparently water is much better at transmitting heat. So basically it will suck the cold out of the ice faster than air. The more you know, baby. Okay, now in Europe, wealthy estates eventually had purpose-built ice houses, often partially underground. It's just like with a cellar or a basement, they're always a bit colder. Same concept with ice houses. Ice harvested from ponds and lakes during winter could be packed inside, insulated with straw or other materials, and kept for months. Pond water, the smell. This meant that the ice they harvested from ponds in the winter could be used to make ice cream in the summer. I must admit, I keep envisioning like a little frog stuck in it, and like someone gets their shaved ice or whatever and they find a frog in it, and it's just like, how'd I get here? Anyway, if you were lucky enough to have your shaved pond ice with a syrup, you were showing off more than one thing. You were kind of like, hey, look at me, I'm bougie. I can afford to have the infrastructure and pay for the labor to get this shit here. And it wasn't just a few people who wanted this ice. In fact, by the 19th century, ice had become an international commodity. In New England, workers cut enormous blocks from frozen ponds and lakes. Horses pulled specialized equipment across the ice. I must say, it's giving Kristoff from Frozen. The blocks were cut into regular shapes, hauled into ice houses, and packed together with insulated material. Then they went on to ships. American ice merchant Frederick Tudor became famous, apparently, for shipping New England ice to warm places where people would pay a premium for it. Ice harvested in Massachusetts was eventually being shipped thousands of miles to places including the Caribbean and India, which is super amazing. And again, sidebar, do you think there were ice pirates? Back to the ice. Now that you've got the ice, you need to give it some pizzazz. But the problem is, if you surround a bowl of cream with ordinary melting ice, the temperature hangs around freezing point of water, but it needs to be colder. So how do you make ice colder? Well, you add salt. By adding salt to your ice, you lower the freezing point. The result is ice and salt mixture can become significantly colder than plain melting ice. I've done this experiment before too. I actually posted a video on my But First Bread TikTok. I happened to look at it earlier this week because I was researching for this episode. I actually think it has like over 600,000 views. But basically, a lot of comments have been in there. People say rock salt works the best, but you have your ice in one bag with ideally rock salt. You have a second bag where you put cream in it. I advise also sugar and vanilla. You seal the inside bag, put it into the ice bag, seal that. I might recommend a towel, and you can squish it between your hands for about 10 minutes. And most of the time it will make ice cream because of this thermodynamic excitement that maybe you've done in elementary school. It's the salt that lowers the temperature enough to freeze the cream enough to make ice cream. And my favorite thing to say once you've completed this is, ice cream, Lieutenant Dan. But back in time, there were no plastic bags. Instead, a container. That container basically was the same concept, two bowls or two like, almost vision like pots, a smaller one and a bigger one. The space between the two pots was filled with salty ice. But there was a problem. Unlike the malleable bags that I could squish between my hands, if something froze on the side of the bowls, it had to be constantly scraped. Otherwise, you'd kind of end up with like slush and liquid. It wasn't pleasant to put in your mouth, etc., etc. And it's kind of labor intensive. Until in 1843, a woman in Philadelphia looked at this whole situation and essentially said, there has to be a better way. And her name was Nancy Maria Johnson. And she is a badass, who we know frustratingly little about. But the things we do know, I'm about to tell you. On September 9th, 1843, Johnson received U.S. patent number 3254 for what she called an artificial freezer. In case you're wondering, according to Google, only 0.6% of all patents issued in the 1800s were issued to women. So she is in the literal 1%. And her machine looks surprisingly familiar for anyone who has an at-home ice maker because it's got the outer bucket, the inner bucket, and inside sits a metal container holding your ice cream mixture. Ice and salt are in the space between the two buckets, and what you do have is you have a crank. So you are stirring and mixing everything at the same time instead of having to kind of like manually go in and get the sides down. Thus, you get a smooth ice cream instead of a frozen brick of dairy, and we love that. It was super simple, it worked, and versions of that basic system would be used for generations. Johnson eventually transferred the patent to William G. Young, reportedly for $200, which in today's money is $9K. Not a lot. And if this were a normal food history, we'd be like, and we're done. That's a wrap. But as I mentioned, she is a badass. So almost 20 years later, the United States was at war. A bit of a downer, to say the least. And Nancy Johnson took this opportunity to go south to Port Royal. Why? Well, let's cut to 1862. Johnson is in her late 60s. She's an aging diva. The Civil War has been raging for less than a year, and she and her sister travel from the north to the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where Port Royal is. In Port Royal, the wealthy white plantation owners fled. Why? Because the Union took over, and they were Confederates. Confederacy, pro-slavery, Union, not so much. So the Confederate slave owners yeeted out of there, which meant that the enslaved black people were left abandoned by their owners. I hate that entire sentence, but that's kind of how to describe what happened. So suddenly, plantations that had been operated through slavery were sitting inside Union-controlled territory where people who had worked the land for years and were unclear on what to do had to make a decision. And this became known as the Port Royal Experiment. Super weird name. But at this point, the Emancipation Proclamation hasn't happened yet. So slavery is still legal in much of the United States, and the war is nowhere near over. But again, you have these people who are in a really unique position. So Northern missionaries, abolitionists, and teachers begin arriving at Port Royal, including who? Nancy Johnson and her sister. While there, one of the biggest priorities is education. South Carolina had restricted teaching enslaved people to read and write, but now adults and children were seeking education. Teachers of the Port Royal schools generally focused on things like reading, writing, and arithmetic. We don't know exactly what Nancy Johnson personally taught. I like to think that she was teaching them everything and kind of thinking like, hey, if I can be in the 1% of people who put out a patent, I'm going to teach you some cool shit. But we don't know. We just know that she was part of a broader educational effort. Because of this unique combination of events, Port Royal itself became a preview of the enormous battles that would follow the Civil War. Why? Because freed families wanted control of the land they had spent generations working. Duh. Some were able to purchase the land. Others occupied abandoned plantations, expecting that the land might eventually become theirs. But then the war ended, and Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Andrew Johnson became president. Confiscated land was returned to the pardoned former Confederates. Big ol' thumbs down. So many freed families lost land they believe was theirs. And that is such a shitty outcome, and I really hate that. But some black ownership survived in what's called the Sea Islands. And the communities there helped preserve the distinctive culture we now know as, I should have looked up this pronunciation, Gullah Geechee culture. Gullah is actually a recognized Creole language, blending English vocabulary with West and Central African grammatical structures and words, in case you're wondering what that language is. And one of the schools established during the Port Royal experiment became the Penn School, later Penn Center. Nearly a century later, it would become a meeting and retreat location for leaders of the civil rights movement. And that's pretty dope. Speaking of dope, ice cream got an upgrade at some point when mechanical refrigeration transformed food production during the 19th and 20th centuries. Factories could make ice cream on a much larger scale. Railroad refrigeration helped move perishable foods. Electric refrigerators and freezers eventually moved into businesses and homes. And suddenly, you didn't need to access a frozen pond to get your ice. You didn't need someone bringing snow down a mountain. You didn't need a ship carrying blocks of Massachusetts winter snow across an ocean. You could make cold wherever you wanted it. And once that happened, ice cream went everywhere. Today we have American-style ice cream, Italian gelato, which is churned with less air and generally served slightly warmer, Indian kulfi, never tried it. I hear traditionally dense and slowly frozen. Write in if you have a favorite. There's also other ones I haven't heard of, including Turkish dondurma, famous apparently for its stretchy, chewy texture. Japanese mochi ice cream, definitely love that. Filipino ube ice cream, love that too. Frozen custard, soft serve, which was an entire food group that I consumed in surviving my university years. We have sorbet, nieves, ice cream sandwiches, ice cream bars, and we eat a staggering amount of this stuff. The average American now eats somewhere around 18 pounds of ice cream per year, depending on the year and how the category is measured. But I'm gonna go with 18 pounds. And I'm just gonna say I'm proud of us. I know we all work really hard at that. I try to invest time in fish food from Ben & Jerry's myself, or chocolate gelato with a side of lemon sorbet. But speaking of working hard, let's get back to Michael Keatley. When we left Michael, he had survived being shot during the robbery of his ice cream truck. According to prosecutors, afterward, he got a little obsessed. He was looking for a man named Creep, or who goes by Creep. 10 months passed. A group of people were gathered outside a home in Ruskin, Florida. Another man approaches. He's looking for Creep. Then the shooting starts. Brothers Juan and Sergio Guitron were killed. 4 other men were wounded. Investigators eventually focused on Michael Keatley. Their theory was that Keatley had become so consumed with finding the person who shot him that he'd gone looking for revenge and attacked the wrong people. Keatley denied it. His defense argued that the injuries he'd actually suffered during the original ice cream truck robbery were so severe that he wouldn't be physically capable to carry out the attack the prosecutors described. And the case dragged on for years. In 2020, Keatley went to trial, but the jury couldn't agree, so it was a mistrial. In 2023, prosecutors tried again, more than 12 years after the shooting, and this time the jury reached a verdict. Michael Keatley was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, which is a very dark ending to a story that began with ice cream. But to me, that's what's so fascinating about looking into the food that intersects with crime. He wasn't just selling ice cream. He was selling a food that originated in the mountains and frozen lakes of yore, and now could come in the shape of a taco or covered in chocolate. So next time your ice cream melts before you get it home, just remember, people used to have to haul this shit down a mountain. Thanks for listening to this week's True Crime Culinary. Follow us on YouTube at True Crime Culinary or Instagram. Same thing, no spaces. We post pictures, share clips, and if you've got a second, rate the show 5 stars. Until next Thursday, see you next week.